It started like just another quiet night in a tired neighborhood, until a gang of troublemakers walked into the wrong diner. They thought they were dealing with a fat, quiet black man too old to fight back, but they had no idea they were walking into the world of a former professional boxer who'd already fought tougher battles than they'd ever imagine. What followed wasn't just a fight, it was a lesson in dignity, in courage, and in what happens when one man decides he's not letting fear run his block. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. So grab a seat, turn up the volume, and let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. In the slow, golden haze of a Jacksonville morning, the sun poured over the cracked sidewalks and gently flickered against the windows of Coleman's Kitchen, a modest soul food diner nestled between a laundromat and an old barber shop with a flickering neon sign. Inside, the scent of smoked ham hocks, fresh-baked cornbread, and slow-cooked greens filled the air like a comforting blanket thick with memory and meaning. The diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was the heartbeat of the block, a soft place for weary folks to land, to trade stories, sip coffee, and find a piece of calm before the world roared back to life. At the center of it all sat Reggie Big Reg Coleman, wiping down the same counter he'd been standing behind for almost 12 years, his massive frame moving with the slow rhythm of someone who'd known both violence and peace, and now chose peace. He was a man built like a tank, but with the kind of eyes that held entire histories behind them, glimpses of stadium lights, fists flying under the roar of crowds, and the sharp silence of a hospital room when it all came to an end. "How's your mama doing?" he asked, gently handing a cup of black coffee to Mrs. Patterson, who had been coming in every morning for the last 20 years, even before he owned the place. "She's holding on," the old woman replied, her voice like crumpled paper, "but she lights up when I bring her your biscuits." Reggie smiled, not the kind of smile that begged for attention, but the quiet kind that made people feel seen, like they mattered. That was his way, no flash, no noise, just presence. But that morning something was different. There was a chill in the air that hadn't been there yesterday, even though the Florida sun still beat down with its usual authority. It wasn't the weather. It was something else, something quieter, heavier, like the hum you feel just before a storm rolls in. At precisely 8:27 a.m., Reggie looked up from the cash register and saw it, a black SUV parked across the street, engine still running, tinted windows, dark as coal, unmoving. It wasn't from around there. He knew every car that passed by his diner, every engine note, every license plate that belonged, and the ones that didn't. This one didn't. He held his stare a moment longer, his brows tightening, then turned back to pour another cup of coffee. He didn't speak about it to anyone, but he made a small mental note, same make and model that had been parked by the corner store last week, before the windows were smashed. Coincidence maybe, but in Reggie's world coincidences were usually just overlooked warnings. The rest of the morning unfolded with its usual rhythm. Someone forgot to order grits, a kid spilled orange juice on the counter, and Old Man Harold argued with himself about whether collard greens were better with or without vinegar. And still the SUV remained. Reggie checked again while rinsing dishes in the back sink, his hands moving on instinct, his mind calculating quietly in the background, like an old fighter measuring distance, timing threat. He could feel the old tension return, not panic, not fear, just that sharpened edge he hadn't needed in years. It had been easy to leave that part of himself behind when he hung up his gloves, or at least he thought it was. Turns out survival is a skill you don't forget, even when you no longer want to use it. By noon, the SUV was gone just like that. No door opened, no one got out, no sound, just absence. Reggie stepped outside with a rag over his shoulder, pretending to adjust the wooden welcome sign, but really just watching the street, studying the silence left in its wake. His mind drifted to a conversation he'd had with his brother back in '98, right after his last fight. "You don't stop being a boxer, Reg," his brother had said. "You just start fighting for different things." And maybe that was true. Maybe this place, this street, this neighborhood full of people too tired to fight back, that was what he'd been training for all along. Not belts or bragging rights, but something simpler, something harder. Later, as the afternoon thinned out and the regulars drifted home to their front porches and recliners, Reggie locked the front door and sat in the booth by the window with a cold, sweet tea and a 1,000-yard stare. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he could feel it building like pressure in his joints before a storm. And he also knew this, whatever it was, he wasn't going to run. Not now. Not ever again. That Thursday afternoon, the sound of clippers buzzed faintly from the barber shop next door, just loud enough to mix with the hum of ceiling fans inside Coleman's kitchen, where Reggie wiped down the same corner booth he always did after the lunch rush. Outside, heat waves shimmered above the cracked pavement, and the scent of summer hot oil grass and gasoline hung low over the street like a tired sigh. Across the road, the same black SUV reappeared, this time with its engine off and one window cracked just enough to see the flicker of movement inside. Reggie didn't need to see faces to know that whoever sat inside wasn't just killing time. They were watching, waiting, measuring something, and that alone made his shoulders stiffen. Around 2:15 p.m., the barbershop door swung open with a metallic creak, and a figure stepped out, tall, wiry, with pale skin and a sharp, angular jaw, wearing a cheap gold chain that glinted in the sun like a warning flare. His name was Travis Boone, and though Reggie had never spoken to him, he knew his type, the way old soldiers recognize the shape of a threat without needing to hear it speak. Behind him came two more men, younger, lean but jittery, the kind of nervous that comes not from fear but from anticipation. They didn't look like locals, not with those pressed jeans, knuckles bruised, and fake smiles stretched too wide. And when Travis stepped onto the sidewalk, he didn't look around like a visitor. He looked like a man about to claim something that didn't belong to him. "You," Jerome Travis called out, voice loud enough to cross the street and make Reggie pause mid-wipe, the cloth in his hand suddenly still. Inside the barber shop, Jerome leaned from his chair, one hand still holding a pair of clippers, his eyes narrowing slightly as he met the stranger's gaze. "Depends," he said, keeping his tone flat. "You looking for a cut or looking for trouble?" Travis chuckled, the sound dry and theatrical, like someone who wanted to be heard laughing more than he wanted to laugh. "Neither," he said, "just checking in on the neighborhood, making sure everybody's safe." The words floated awkwardly in the heat, too smooth to sound, genuine, too rehearsed to be harmless. One of the younger men picked up a magazine from the barbershop bench and flipped it without looking his eyes, sweeping the room instead, scanning the corners, the faces, the exits. The other leaned against the wall and cracked his knuckles slowly, as if that alone could say what they weren't yet ready to speak aloud. Reggie watched it unfold, from behind the diner glass, his arms folded across his chest, jaw tight, not with fear but with the awareness that something was changing, and the air didn't feel right anymore. Jerome stepped out, wiping his hands on a stained towel, his voice carrying just enough edge to mark the line. "Whatever it is you're selling, I ain't interested. We're doing just fine without protection." Travis took a slow step forward, hands still in his pockets, smile too wide. "That's good to hear," he said, eyes glinting. "But see, these days, things ain't always fine. Windows break, stuff goes missing, folks. Forget who's looking out for them. We just like to remind folks, doesn't hurt to have friends." The threat sat there naked under the guise of friendliness, and Reggie could see Jerome's fingers twitch slightly at his side, a subtle motion, but enough for someone like him to notice. Inside the diner, a waitress whispered, "That's him, right?" Reggie didn't answer. He stepped back from the window and walked to the counter, flipping off the griddle and setting down his apron. He didn't like the way Travis talked, but more than that, he didn't like the way the man looked at the shop like it was already his, like it was just a matter of time. Reggie had spent years learning how to avoid unnecessary fights, how to walk away even when the blood screamed otherwise. But he also knew what it meant to stand still when something needed standing against, and right now that feeling settled in his chest like the tightening of an old glove. Outside, Travis turned toward the diner, catching Reggie's eye through the glass and lifting two fingers in a mock salute. "Nice place," he called, voice bright but laced with mockery. "Maybe I'll stop by tomorrow, see how the food is." Reggie didn't blink. He just stared back, not smiling, not scowling, just letting the silence speak what needed speaking. Travis held the look for another beat before shrugging, turning back to his crew, and walking slowly down the sidewalk, dragging the quiet behind him like a blanket soaked in gasoline. The street returned to its usual rhythm after they left, but the silence they carried didn't leave. It lingered in the barbershop's doorway, in the narrow alley between buildings, in the shadow of the SUV that still idled 2 blocks down before disappearing again without a trace. Inside Coleman's kitchen, Reggie refilled the coffee urn with a heavy hand, his mind turning over the moment like a stone he couldn't quite set down. He didn't like the way Jerome had looked, cornered, defensive, and trying too hard not to show it. And he didn't like the message behind the visit, the way it felt like a rehearsal for something bigger, more violent, more permanent. That evening, Reggie sat alone in the back of the diner with a glass of iced tea sweating against the wood table, watching the dusk fall over his part of Jacksonville, with the kind of quiet that only comes when something's been disturbed. He didn't speak much to the others that night, not even to Layla when she brought him his favorite slice of sweet potato pie. He just said, "Thanks, sugar," and kept his gaze on the streetlight across the way, watching it flicker like it was trying to decide whether to stay lit or go dark. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure which one he hoped for. On a shelf in the back office of Coleman's kitchen, half hidden beneath a stack of old ledger books and faded family photos, sat a dusty shoebox taped at the corners, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. Reggie hadn't touched it in a long time, not since the anniversary of his retirement 4 years ago, when Layla found it by accident while cleaning, and asked him, "Uncle Reg, is that you on this poster?" She was holding a glossy fight card from '91, the one where he knocked out Calvin, the Brick Jensen in the 3rd round, back when the world still called him the Alabama Hammer, and ESPN used his face to sell Friday night fights. That night he had quietly taken the box from her hands, said nothing, and tucked it away behind the ledgers, as if silence could erase the weight of history folded inside. But today, as the silence from that black SUV still echoed in his mind, Reggie found himself sitting at the desk, shoebox in his lap, peeling back the brittle tape with fingers that had once been feared from Vegas to Philadelphia. Inside were pieces of a life that didn't belong to the man running the diner, the mouthguard stained with dried blood, a pair of hand wraps still curled in shape of his fists, a torn Polaroid of him, and his trainer arms slung around each other, grinning through bruises. He reached for the photo slowly, his thumb brushing over the face of his coach, Mickey Slater, gone now more than a decade. Mickey had been part father, part tactician, and part drill sergeant, the only man who could scream in Reggie's face and get a nod in return. "You don't win by being angry," Mickey had once told him, pacing the ring after a sloppy sparring session. "You win by being patient, by knowing what the other man's going to do before he does it. Anyone can hit. A fighter listens." Those words echoed now, not with nostalgia, but with something heavier, something closer to warning. Because Reggie had been listening to the silence, to the way Jerome's hands had trembled, to the way Travis's words didn't match his eyes. And all of it told him the same thing. This wasn't just a shakedown. It was a storm gathering at the edge of the neighborhood, waiting for one wrong move to blow in hard. He leaned back in the creaky office chair, the frame groaning beneath his weight, and looked at his hands. The knuckles were swollen still, even after all these years, scar tissue that never quite healed, reminders of every fight he didn't walk away clean from. People called him Big Reg, like it was a nickname, a term of endearment, but sometimes it felt more like a label he'd been boxed into. Big shoulders to carry the weight of a broken community. Big fists to settle things the law never got around to. Big silence that let him fade into the background when all he really wanted was to disappear. He never told anyone what happened after his last fight. It was supposed to be a retirement match, a farewell victory in front of a home crowd. But in the 7th round, something shifted. A punch came in, too fast, too close, hit a spot behind his ear that blurred the ring into streaks of light. He won anyway, sheer instinct carrying him to the bell. But later that night, he collapsed in the locker room, his vision doubled and chest tightening, like someone had cinched a belt inside him. "One more shot like that," the doctor told him, "and you may not get back up." So he walked away, just like that. No press conference, no goodbye. Just packed a bag and left the circuit without looking back. He'd rather be forgotten than pitied. But now, watching shadows stretch longer outside his window and feeling the edge of something approaching, he wondered if leaving had been enough. You can step away from the ring, he thought, but sometimes the fight finds you anyway. That kind of truth doesn't shout. It settles in slowly, like humidity you didn't notice until your shirt's soaked through. He reached into the box again, this time pulling out a folded piece of notebook paper. It was a list Mickey had made before a championship match. 1. Stay low. 2. Don't get emotional. 3. Win with your head, not your heart. The corners were smudged with sweat and ink from years ago, but the words still carried weight. As he sat there, the sound of the diner slowly filtered back, pots clinking, a broom brushing over tile, Layla humming softly in the kitchen. The world was still moving, pretending nothing had changed. But inside Reggie, something had already shifted. Not fear exactly. He'd faced men twice his size, with nothing but tape on his hands and belief in his gut. No, what he felt now was a kind of responsibility, the quiet knowledge that you don't get to sit down forever when the people around you are still standing in the line of fire. He placed the shoebox gently back on the shelf, slid the photo into his shirt pocket without a word, and walked back into the diner where the light was soft and golden and the door still jingled when someone stepped inside. The fight wasn't coming. It was already here, it just hadn't swung yet. And Reggie, despite the years and the silence and the aching bones, knew he'd be ready when it did. The day it happened started just like any other, with the scent of fresh coffee drifting through Coleman's kitchen, mixing with the low murmur of old friends swapping stories at the corner booth, their voices seasoned like the food they swore by. Reggie moved through the room like a ship through familiar waters, quiet, solid, steady, his thick hands expertly folding towels behind the counter while keeping half an eye on the street beyond the window. The rhythm of the diner soothed him, each clatter of a plate and scrape of a chair like a verse in a song he'd heard 1,000 times before. But even a song, no matter how familiar, can break mid-note when something sharp cuts through the air. Around 11:30, just as Layla was refilling napkin holders near the front, the door swung open with a force that made the bell jingle violently against the glass. 3 figures walked in. Travis Boone in the lead, shoulders squared, and lips curled into a smirk that had nothing to do with good manners. Behind him, the 2 men from before flanked him like vultures, their eyes scanning the room not for a seat but for a reaction. Conversation died mid-sentence. Reggie straightened slowly from where he was arranging a stack of menus, not surprised but not relaxed either. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Shoulders back, feet grounded, breath slowed. Years in the ring had taught him the importance of stillness before the first punch. "Nice spot you got here," Travis said, his voice casual, almost amused, like he'd walked into a candy store instead of someone else's place of pride. He took a slow glance around his boots, echoing on the tile floor, before he turned his eyes on Layla. "You serve anything besides fried food and attitude." She froze for half a second, just long enough for Reggie to see her hands tighten around the napkin stack, then said quietly, but clearly, "Only thing we don't serve here is disrespect." Travis laughed. "Oh, she got sass," he said, stepping closer, "but I like that. Keeps the neighborhood interesting." Reggie stepped out from behind the counter before he even thought about it. Not fast or aggressive, just deliberate, like a man with no time for games. "You've made your point," he said, voice even low, the kind of voice that doesn't rise because it doesn't need to. "Now walk out while you still can." Travis turned to him, the smile fading just enough to show the bones underneath. "You threatening me, big man?" he asked, head cocked slightly. "I'm just telling you what'll happen if you keep standing where you don't belong," Reggie replied, folding his arms, gaze steady. Behind Travis, one of the younger guys shifted his weight, nervous already, eyes darting toward the door like he wasn't sure how this would go. For a moment, everything held still, the kind of stillness that hums not with peace but with possibility. Then Travis, slow and smug, turned and stepped up to Reggie until they were barely 2 feet apart. "You think just 'cause you're big, you can scare people," he said, his tone tightening. "Thing is, people like you guys who hide behind reputation and old stories, y'all crumble real easy when someone new comes around." Reggie didn't blink. "Then take your shot," he said softly, "but just know it won't end the way you think." The diner felt smaller, suddenly the air thicker, like something invisible had closed around everyone and refused to let go. Reggie could see Layla out of the corner of his eye, her lips parted, slightly fists clenched at her sides, the way a child watches an adult decide whether they're going to do something regrettable. "That's enough," she said, stepping forward now, and her voice had a crack to it, the kind that made people turn their heads. "You don't scare anybody in here. And if you think you do, then you've got the wrong address." Travis looked over at her and something flickered across his face, annoyance, calculation, maybe even shame, but it passed as quickly as it came. He turned back to Reggie. "You just made a real bad mistake," he said, stepping back, lifting one hand like he was swatting away an invisible fly. "This place, it's gonna feel different real soon." He backed toward the door, the other 2 following. Just before he left, he jabbed a finger in Reggie's direction. "You could have stayed quiet, old man. Would have been easier for everyone." Reggie didn't move, didn't answer, didn't even glance at the finger pointing at his chest. He just stood there like a tree that had already lived through every storm and had no interest in explaining itself. When the door finally closed behind them, the bell ringing once and falling still, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the quiet before the real tension began to set in. Layla came over, placing a trembling hand on the counter. "You okay?" she asked. Reggie exhaled, slowly, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, though his jaw was tight. and his gaze lingered on the spot where Travis had stood. "But this ain't over." He said it not like a prediction but like a truth already confirmed, written somewhere only he could read. He picked up a rag and started wiping the countertop again, his movements slow, controlled, but his mind elsewhere. The weight of what had just happened wasn't in the noise or the threats, it was in the knowing. Reggie had seen this before in different forms and under different names, and it always followed the same pattern. A man walks in, thinking he owns the place, and if he's not checked, he just might. That's what people like Travis counted on: the silence, the shrinking, the compliance. But Reggie had made a choice the moment Travis looked at Layla, like she was something he could shake. Some fights you walk away from. Others you walk straight into because something larger than your own peace depends on it. And as he stood there wiping that same clean counter again, the sweat drying slowly beneath his shirt, and the smell of hot oil still lingering in the air, he felt not fear or anger, but clarity. He knew who he was. He knew what he'd once been. And now, more than anything, he knew what he was going to have to do. It started with a noise too small for most to notice, just a gentle scratching like paper dragged across concrete, but to Reggie, it rang out louder than a gunshot in church. He had opened Coleman's kitchen just after 6 that morning, as he always did, with the quiet company of sunrise bleeding through the blinds and the low rattle of the ceiling fan catching the stillness in its blades. Layla wasn't due for another hour, and the world outside hadn't yet shaken off the hush of sleep, so when he found the note wedged into the doorframe, it wasn't the words that shook him, it was the carelessness of the act itself. Whoever had left it hadn't bothered to hide their intent. The paper was torn crudely from a notebook, the ink scrawled in thick black lines like it had been written by someone trying to convince themselves they weren't afraid. "This ain't over. Next time we finish the job." Reggie stood there for a long minute, the note loose between his fingers' eyes, scanning the sidewalk as if the words might point him to the hand that wrote them. The street was empty, only a cat darting beneath a rusted sedan, and the faint hiss of a bus braking 2 blocks away. He folded the paper once, twice, slid it into his shirt pocket, and turned the lock behind him with deliberate slowness, like a man securing more than a door, like someone tying down memories that didn't belong in daylight. Inside, the diner felt smaller somehow, as if the shadows had crept a little closer during the night and brought something unwelcome with them. Jerome arrived just after 8, eyes bloodshot and gait tight with unease, and Reggie didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You see this?" he asked, sliding the note across the counter. Jerome looked at it, jaw tightening with each word, his hand unconsciously reaching to scratch the back of his neck, a tell Reggie had come to recognize over the years. "Came in early, saw it stuck in the door," Reggie added, voice even but strained at the edges. Jerome didn't speak right away. He just stared at the note like it had insulted him personally. Then finally he said, "You call the cops." Reggie gave a low laugh, bitter and soft. "And tell them what? That someone left us a warning in bad handwriting." He leaned forward slightly. "They didn't listen before. You think they'll start now?" Jerome exhaled, slowly rubbing a thumb along his jaw. "You think it was them?" Reggie gave a look that said he didn't need to answer. "I checked the cameras," Jerome muttered. "They stayed out of view. They're not dumb, just mean." That line hung in the air for a moment, not dumb, just mean, as if it explained more than it should. Reggie walked over to the window, hands on hips, and stared out into the morning like he could see trouble coming down the road in the shape of heat waves. "They're not just messing with us," he said. "Finally, they're testing us, seeing how far we'll bend before we break." The diner began to fill slowly, regulars filtering in with tired smiles and empty mugs, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of their morning rituals. Reggie moved through them like always, polite nods, fresh coffee, the usual banter. But behind each interaction was a tension. He couldn't shake a dull throb in the back of his mind that no smile could ease. When Layla arrived just before 10, he handed her the note without a word. She read it once, then looked up at him, eyes wide but calm. "What do you want to do?" she asked, and Reggie could hear something steady in her voice, something that told him she'd already made peace with whatever answer he gave. "I don't want to do anything," he said, "but they're not going to let that be an option." He saw the way she squared her shoulders then, like a branch refusing to bend under weight, and he felt a surge of pride and guilt crash together in his chest. She was just a kid when he took her in, her father gone, her mother stretched thin with too many jobs and not enough peace, and now she was here standing in the middle of a threat she never asked for. "If it comes to it," Layla said, "I can stay late. Help watch the place." Reggie shook his head. "You'll do no such thing. I can handle it." But even as he said it, the weight in his voice betrayed him. By evening, the sky turned the color of old pennies, and the street grew quiet in that particular way it does when people sense something wrong but don't know how to name it. Reggie stood outside for a while, watching the same corners, the same parked cars, the same shadows that seemed just a bit darker than usual. At one point, he thought he saw movement near the alley by the barber shop, but when he stepped closer there was nothing but a wisp of cigarette smoke drifting through the air and the faint echo of hurried footsteps on gravel. That night, when the diner closed and the chairs were turned over, Reggie didn't go straight home. Instead, he sat alone at the back booth, lights dimmed, hands folded over the edge of the table. He thought about calling anyone, but the truth was he didn't know who'd pick up that could do more than listen. The law didn't care until it was too late, and most of the neighborhood had been too beaten down by years of threats and silence to speak up now. He knew what came next. He'd seen it before in gyms, where money changed hands behind lockers in bars, where bruised men whispered about debts they couldn't repay. You don't scare people with violence, you scare them by making them feel alone. The note in his pocket felt heavier now, like it had weight beyond paper and ink. He unfolded it once more, laid it flat on the table, and stared at the words until they blurred. This ain't over. Next time we finish the job. Reggie didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He just sat there watching the words like they were daring him to blink. Then, after a long breath, he pulled a pen from the holder near the register and wrote something across the bottom of the page. Simple, quiet, final. We'll see. He folded it neatly and tucked it into the drawer beneath the counter. A quiet promise left waiting for whoever might come next. Outside, the streetlight flickered once, then held steady. And inside, Reggie leaned back in his seat, eyes closed for a moment, breathing deep through his nose, like a man learning how to steel himself for the thing he hoped wouldn't come. But even as he sat still, there was no question in his mind: if the storm was on its way, he'd meet it head on. Not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. That night, long after the lights in Coleman's kitchen had gone dim and the streets outside had surrendered to the heavy silence of midnight, Reggie sat alone in his office, with an old leather-bound notebook open in front of him, its pages, yellowed corners curled and spine creaking like tired knees. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, steady and low, a kind of mechanical heartbeat that matched the rhythm of his own thoughts, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. He hadn't written anything yet. He just sat there, staring at the blank page pen resting between his fingers, as if waiting for something inside him to settle before he committed to action. But nothing settled. Not the knot in his chest, not the weight behind his eyes, not the burn in his jaw, where tension had taken up permanent residence. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, in the way only places burdened by tension can be: too still, too neat, like a poker face on the verge of a breakdown. Reggie had spent years convincing himself that he could outgrow the fighter in him, that if he just stayed in his lane, kept his hands clean, and poured enough coffee, the world might let him be. But now he knew better. The world didn't care how long you'd been quiet. It only cared how loud your silence had become when it was time to speak. And Reggie, though tired of violence, was even more tired of watching good people shrink under the weight of someone else's threats. He clicked the pen open with a sharp snap, wrote one word at the top of the page, call, and underlined it twice. Then he flipped through the contacts on his phone, stopping on a name he hadn't seen lit up in years: Jackson Iron Jack Carter. A man built like a concrete wall, with fists that moved like pistons, and a code of honor thicker than his biceps. They hadn't spoken in a long time, not out of conflict, just distance, both geographical and emotional, but some bonds never loosen, even with rust and silence in between. Reggie tapped the screen before he could second-guess himself, listened as the phone rang once, then again, and then a third time before a voice crackled through the line like gravel under boots. Coleman Jack said, not a question, not a greeting, just a name carried by memory. Reggie exhaled, felt the edge in his chest ease just a little. Yeah, it's me, he replied. Didn't think I'd be calling you this late unless it was about something real. There was a pause, and then Jack chuckled low and slow. Well, damn, he said, must be real then. Reggie didn't waste time on small talk. I've got a problem. Couple of punks think they can own this neighborhood, and they're starting to believe their own noise. I need some help, clean help, no guns, just presence. Another pause. Then you know where I stand, Reg. What do you need? Reggie smiled faintly, more in his chest than his mouth. I need a few of the old crew. You, Tyrone, Victor, maybe Malik if he's still quick on his feet. Just one night. Just enough to remind some folks that this block's got backbone. Jack let out a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. Malik's quicker than ever. He runs a gym in Atlanta now. Tyrone's working security for a warehouse, still benching more than he should. And Vic's just looking for something to hit. We'll be there. Reggie nodded, even though Jack couldn't see it. Tomorrow night. Coleman's kitchen. I'll make sure the bait is obvious. They'll come looking for weakness and find something else. Jack's voice dropped into something lower, steadier. You sure you're ready for this? Reggie didn't hesitate. I was born ready. I just tried to forget that part for a while. After they hung up, Reggie sat back, staring at the name Jack Carter, now glowing faintly on his call history, and let the silence come back around him like a familiar coat. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel relieved. He felt grounded, like the truth had finally landed in his chest and dug its heels in. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't ego. It was necessity. Some men choose peace, and some men are chosen by war, and every once in a while peace has to be defended by those who've seen too much to pretend otherwise. He scribbled down a few more notes, timing entrances, hiding spots, and closed the notebook gently, laying it on top of the counter like a chess player sealing a move. He turned off the last of the lights and walked out onto the sidewalk, the night air humid and thick, filled with the soft rustle of leaves and distant tires rolling over gravel. His eyes scanned the street corner to corner, shadow to shadow, and then settled on the lamppost across from the diner, the same one that had flickered 2 nights ago when the SUV first appeared. It was steady now, glowing amber like a warning signal that had stopped trying to be subtle. Reggie took a deep breath and let it out slowly, like a man emptying his lungs before a fight, not because he's afraid, but because control matters more than fear. Then he muttered to himself, low and certain, "They're not gonna know what hit them." He didn't say it with pride. He said it with purpose. The kind of purpose that comes when you realize that the line has already been drawn, and whether you wanted to or not, you're the one holding the chalk. Reggie always believed in the power of planning, not because he distrusted instinct, but because instinct without preparation was just noise waiting to collapse under pressure. So, the morning after his call with Jack, before the sun had even stretched across the sidewalk outside Coleman's kitchen, Reggie stood in the back hallway of the diner with a blueprint he'd sketched from memory, the layout of the shop, alley, the exits, and every point where chaos might sneak through unnoticed. The air was still cool, the floor beneath his feet just beginning to warm from the oven kicking on, and the smell of fresh dough and simmering broth drifted through the kitchen like reassurance. But Reggie's focus wasn't on food today, it was on time, movement, silence, and control. Because the kind of men he was up against didn't believe in fairness. They believed in surprise, intimidation, and numbers. And, if they were going to come, he'd make sure they walked straight into something they couldn't bully their way out of. He moved slowly through the diner, noting angles, corners, and shadows. He checked the door locks twice, measured the width of the counter, and ran his hand along the edge of each booth like he was reacquainting himself with a familiar opponent. Then, without a word, he stepped outside and crossed the street to the barber shop. Jerome was already sweeping the sidewalk, headphones in his movements, automatic and half distracted. Reggie waited until the man noticed him, then gave a small nod, the kind that didn't need to be explained. Jerome pulled out one earbud. "They coming?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They will," Reggie said. "Tomorrow night. After close. They'll think I'm alone." Jerome frowned, leaning on his broom eyes, scanning the block like it might offer a safer answer. "You sure this is the right way?" he asked, quieter now, voice low and uncertain. "No," Reggie admitted, "but it's the only way they'll stop." They stood in silence for a moment, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the low rumble of a garbage truck 2 blocks over. Then Jerome spoke again. "You want me there?" Reggie shook his head. "I want you home. Safe. Word needs to get out that I'll be closing up alone late. You know how to let that kind of thing slip." Jerome sighed, looked at the broom in his hand like it might offer some wisdom, then said, "All right. But you better not be in my damn shop." Reggie cracked a faint smile. "I don't plan on it." Back inside the kitchen, Reggie reached for his notebook again and wrote 3 words at the top of a clean page. Timing, noise, pressure. These were the tools he'd learned to master in the ring. Wait for the swing, see the breath before it leaves the lungs, strike when the soul isn't ready. And now he was putting them to work in a space that had once only been about sweet tea, slow-cooked oxtails, and blues music, humming from a tinny radio. There was a strange poetry to it all, a final fight, not beneath stadium lights but under fluorescent bulbs and between booths that had seated generations of families. He made his next call just after noon. The voice that answered was deep, full of quiet heat, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to command a room. Tyrone, Reggie said, smiling as he leaned against the back wall. "You still got that left hook, or did you trade it in for a security badge?" A pause, then a low chuckle. "You gettin' soft, Coleman," Tyrone replied, calling me out of the blue like we're boys who talk about feelings. Reggie laughed softly. "Ain't about feelings. It's about something that needs doing." He explained the plan, the time, the place. "I need you on the inside, watching the alley. If they come in that way, I want 'em on the ground before they get to me." Tyrone didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'll be there," and hung up. The same pattern followed for Victor and Malik. Each call short, quiet, to the point. No bravado, no nostalgia, just men who had once bled beside Reggie in sparring rings and training gyms, answering the bell one more time, not for pride, but for purpose. By dusk, the plan was set like a silent engine waiting to roar. 4 men, each stationed in shadow, each carrying nothing but muscle reflex and history. No weapons, no chaos, just precision and presence. That evening, Reggie met Jerome again, this time behind the shop beneath the humming orange glow of the alley's only working light. "You tell them?" Reggie asked. Jerome nodded. "Slipped it to old Henry while he was complaining about his gout. Half the street knows by now you're working late tomorrow." Reggie looked toward the sky, the stars barely visible through the haze of streetlights, and felt the weight of it settle. "Good," he said. "Let them think they've got the upper hand." They stood there a while longer, neither speaking until finally Jerome broke the silence. "You scared, Reggie?" Considered the question not with denial but with honesty. "No," he said. "I'm tired. And sometimes tired men are the most dangerous." Jerome looked at him, nodded once, and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Don't be a damn hero. Just come out breathing." When Reggie returned home that night, the silence of his apartment felt heavier than usual, not empty, just watchful. He didn't bother turning on the television or checking his phone. Instead, he sat at the edge of the bed and unlaced his boots slowly, the sound of the worn leather stretching like a deep breath after a long day. He looked around the room, framed photos, old gloves mounted on the wall, a lamp flickering in the corner, like it couldn't decide whether to fight, sleep, or give in. Then he leaned back on the mattress, arms folded across his chest, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He didn't pray. He didn't rehearse. He didn't fantasize about revenge. He just thought about the look on Layla's face when she read that note. He thought about the way Jerome's hands trembled when he held his clippers that morning. He thought about every man who ever walked into a place like his and decided it was theirs to take. And then he closed his eyes, not for rest, but for clarity, and whispered to no one in particular. "Tomorrow we remind them what respect looks like." By the time the sky had dimmed into that soft purple hue, only southern evenings seemed to know how to hold. Coleman's kitchen sat quiet beneath the glow of a lone street lamp, its open sign buzzing with tired electricity like a weary heart, refusing to rest. Reggie stood behind the counter, not moving, just watching the front window, where his own reflection stared back at him through the glass broad shoulders, slightly stooped, jaw-tight eyes, calm but unreadable. The place was spotless, not because he'd been cleaning, but because Layla and Jerome had insisted on it before they left earlier that evening, as if a tidy battlefield somehow made it easier to face whatever was coming next. He had let them go without protest, watched as Jerome's pickup disappeared down the block and Layla's footsteps faded into the alley, though the silence left in their absence was louder than anything they might have said. Outside, the air was heavy with moisture and the distant rumble of someone's bass drifting lazily from a passing car. But otherwise, the neighborhood was still, eerily still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from tension, holding its breath. Reggie reached beneath the counter and slid his old notebook into a drawer, its corners frayed and pages dog-eared from years of use. He didn't need it anymore. The plan was set, the pieces in motion, and now all that was left was the waiting, the kind of waiting that never really leaves you no matter how many fights you've seen. At 9:57 p.m., a soft knock came at the back door, 3 taps, then won the signal. Reggie walked to the kitchen and opened it just wide enough to let in the first shadow. Jack Carter entered first, eyes scanning the room like he was counting exits in his head before he even said hello. Behind him, Tyrone ducked under the low doorframe, followed closely by Victor and Malik, each man dressed in plain dark clothing sleeves, rolled hands empty but ready. They greeted Reggie with firm nods and quiet words, not out of coldness but respect. There was no need for speeches tonight. Jack was the last to speak. "We ready?" he asked, voice low and steady. Reggie didn't answer immediately, he just looked around at the men. These brothers he hadn't stood beside in years, and gave one single nod. The four positioned themselves without instruction, each taking the spot Reggie had marked for them earlier in the week. Tyrone near the back exit, Malik by the storage room entrance, Victor crouched low behind the far end of the counter, and Jack positioned just out of view near the coat rack. The lights in the front of the diner were dimmed, now casting long shadows along the booths, the kind of shadows that played tricks on weak minds and made strong ones think twice. Reggie remained by the register apron, still on towel, draped casually over one shoulder like it was any other night. That was the point. Make it look normal. Let them think they still held control. At exactly 10:03 p.m., the door creaked open with a sound that felt both sharp and sluggish, like time had thickened in the air. Travis stepped in first, flanked by two new faces, young, twitchy, and trying too hard to look composed, and three more men followed, spreading through the space like oil spilled across a floor. Reggie didn't flinch. He met their entrance with the same stillness he'd worn since dawn, letting them read nothing from his face but an unreadable calm. Travis let the door fall shut behind him, the bell above, jingling once before fading into silence. "Well, look who's waiting up for us," Travis said, his voice tinged with mock delight. He took a few slow steps forward, dragging one boot across the tile, a sound that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet. "Figured you'd be long gone after that little love note we left you." Reggie didn't answer, just leaned slightly on the counter, hands open, posture relaxed. "Just closing up," he said, voice low but clear. "Didn't expect company." Travis chuckled, turning toward his crew. "You hear that he didn't expect us? How rude would it be to disappoint?" The others spread out slowly, one leaning against the wall near the window, another picking up a salt shaker and setting it down like it was some kind of signal. Reggie's eyes flicked once toward the front door, still unlocked, just as planned. He waited until they'd fully entered, until the last man stepped through, and the door eased shut behind him with a soft click. Then, without a word, Reggie tapped the screen of his phone beneath the counter, just once, barely more than a breath. Outside, the sound of car doors opening cracked through the quiet, not loud, but sharp enough to cut tension like a blade. Travis's smile twitched. He turned his head slowly toward the window and saw the silhouettes, four of them spread across the street, walking toward the diner with the kind of stride that didn't hesitate. "What the hell is this?" one of the younger men muttered, reaching for something under his coat, but Reggie's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't," he said without raising his tone. "They're just here to make sure everybody plays fair." Travis took a step back, eyes narrowing, the swagger in his shoulders, giving way to calculation. "You think four old boxers are gonna stop us," he said, but there was something thinner in his voice now, something strained. Reggie shrugged, his tone still calm. "You brought numbers. I brought men who know what to do with pressure." The line landed quietly, but it hit hard. For the first time since walking in, the gang hesitated. They weren't used to this. They were used to fear, to compliance, to empty threats, and power taken without resistance. But this was different, and Reggie knew it. He didn't need to throw the first punch. He just needed them to feel the weight of consequences press down on every inch of the room. And as the silence stretched thick and unyielding, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Last chance to leave with dignity." The words didn't carry anger. They carried a truth that even Travis couldn't ignore. One of the younger men shifted his feet, eyes darting toward the door. No one moved to stop him. Not yet. In that moment, with the smell of fried grease still faint in the air and the old jukebox silent in the corner, Reggie felt a stillness return, not the tense quiet from before, but the kind that comes from reclaiming control. He didn't know if they'd walk or fight, but either way, he knew what came next wouldn't be taken from him, it would be earned, and that made all the difference. The moment it began wasn't marked by shouting or chaos, but by a shift so subtle it could have been mistaken for silence. One of the younger men, barely older than 20 by the look of him, took a single step too close, his chain swinging at his side like a pendulum counting down to violence. Jack's eyes narrowed from his position near the coat rack, body coiled like a spring, and in that breath of hesitation the room lost its balance. The kid lunged, the chain whipped through the air, and Reggie saw it all as if it were underwater, slow, inevitable, exact. The chain missed by inches, crashing into a table that splintered on impact, and the sound exploded through the diner like a starting bell no one had agreed to ring. Reggie moved first, not away, not back, but forward with the smooth, grounded power of a man who understood momentum better than most people understand breathing. His left hand caught the attacker's shoulder, pulled him off balance, and his right came up with a clean, short jab that connected under the chin like a punctuation mark. The kid dropped with a dull thud, not unconscious, but done. It should have ended there. But ego doesn't leave quietly, and neither did Travis. "Get him!" he barked, and suddenly the room was alive with motion. Boots, scraping, tile chairs, tipping fists, flying in wide, desperate arcs that smelled more like panic than strategy. Tyrone blocked a wild swing with his forearm and responded with a body shot that folded his opponent like a paper bag. Victor darted low, his movement sharp and angled, using the space between booths to deliver a low kick that took the legs out from under a man swinging a crowbar. Malik moved with an eerie calm, sidestepping 2 swings before trapping a wrist and twisting it just enough to disarm, without breaking just enough to say "I could've." In the middle of it all, Reggie's body remembered its training like it was muscle memory carved into his bones. He ducked one punch, countered another, and drove his shoulder into a second man's chest, sending him stumbling back into the coat stand with a crash that knocked the wind from both his lungs and his pride. The fight wasn't graceful. It was fast, brutal, and tight. There wasn't space for posturing or empty threats, just instinct and breath, weight and timing. Reggie didn't feel invincible. He felt necessary. Every movement he made came from a place beyond anger, beyond fear. It came from the hard-earned knowledge that sometimes peace only arrives after you've made it clear you won't be moved. Travis came at him with a cracked bottle, the jagged glass catching light like a desperate lie. "You think you're gonna scare me?" he growled, breath hot and shaking. Reggie didn't answer. He stepped into the swing, blocked the bottle with his forearm, and landed a right hook that sent Travis sprawling across a booth and sliding onto the floor. For a moment, no one moved, not the fighters, not the spectators outside the windows, not even the bell above the door which had been rattling for nearly 30 seconds straight. The only sound was the sharp, uneven breathing of men who'd underestimated both their target and his resolve. Reggie wiped a line of sweat from his temple chest, heaving, then turned to the kid still groaning by the broken table. "You had a choice," he said, not unkindly, "but now you've got to live with the one you made." Jack stepped forward, his voice steady and sharp. "Anyone else want to test their luck?" The remaining 2 gang members, faces bruised and eyes wide, took hesitant steps back. One dropped a pipe. The other lowered his fists and raised both hands, wordless but clear. "That's what I thought," Jack muttered. Reggie didn't gloat, didn't shout. He simply pointed toward the door. "Go," he said, and they went fast, quiet, broken, in ways that wouldn't heal with ice or sleep. Travis tried to sit up, one eye, swollen jaw clenched with something between rage and shame. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You got no idea who you just crossed." Reggie walked over slowly, every step as deliberate as the one that had carried him into the ring all those years ago. He crouched beside Travis, voice low but clear. "You think respect is something you take, but it's something you earn, and you just lost your chance." He stood again, turned toward the others, and scanned the room, not for threats but for breath, making sure every one of his own was still standing. They were bruised, sweating, but upright. That was enough. The door creaked open again, this time not with aggression but with the uncertain weight of authority. 2 patrol officers stepped in, hands near their belts, eyes darting to the scene, tables, broken chairs, overturned blood on the floor, but no gunfire, no bystanders hurt. One of them stepped forward. "Someone called in a disturbance," he said. "Looks like they were right." Reggie nodded slowly. "They came in looking for a fight," he replied. "They found one." The officer's eyes moved over the bodies on the ground, resting a moment on Travis, then flicking toward Jack, who was folding a dislocated chair back into place like he was tidying up after dinner. "We'll be taking statements," the officer said, tone clipped but cautious. Reggie didn't argue. He just gestured toward the pile of weapons on the floor. "Start with those," he said, then walked behind the counter and picked up a damp towel, wiping down the register as if restoring the space 1 square inch at a time. Outside, the crowd that had gathered was already starting to thin, but not before a few voices broke through the night air. "That's Reggie Coleman," someone whispered. "He used to be a fighter. Guess he still is." And maybe that was true. Maybe no one ever really stopped being what they were built to be, they just found new reasons to keep standing. As Reggie looked around the room, his eyes paused on the jukebox, still silent, still untouched through all the chaos. He walked over, pressed a button, and watched as it whirred to life lights flickering weakly before settling into a warm, steady glow. The blues song that played was soft, slow, something old and true. It filled the space like balm, not over the wounds, but into them, settling deep where fists couldn't reach. Reggie leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and let the music wash over what remained. The fight was over. The message had been delivered. And now, in the low hum of battered peace, the neighborhood exhaled. It wasn't the bruises that stayed with Reggie the most, those faded as they always did, but the silence that followed after the fight, a silence so heavy it seemed to press into the walls of Coleman's kitchen like fog, creeping through floorboards. Morning light filtered through the windows in long golden stripes, landing on overturned chairs, scattered salt shakers, and the faint reddish smudges on the tile that no mop could erase completely. Jack stood near the front window, arms crossed, watching the street, like he expected someone to come walking back for a rematch, while Victor and Malik swept in slow, tired strokes, their faces drawn but peaceful, in a way that only came after doing what needed to be done. The scent of sweat still clung to the air, mixing with the sharper tang of blood and broken wood, but no one complained about it. It was the kind of smell men recognized without speaking, one that said survival, not defeat. Reggie moved slowly between the tables, writing chairs, wiping off crumbs, feeling every muscle in his back protest with the kind of soreness that comes not from fear, but from having stood your ground. He wasn't limping, but he walked like a man who had done more than his body should allow. Malik caught his eye at one point, offered a small nod. "We held, old man," he said, voice rasped but steady. Reggie gave a faint grin, not wide, just enough to let the truth of those words settle deep. "Yeah," he replied. "We did." The police had already come and gone, 2 cruisers and a sergeant who looked more annoyed than concerned. They took statements, snapped a few photos, then radioed in backup that never showed. One of the younger officers had pointed to the broken window and asked flatly, "You gonna fix that yourself?" Reggie hadn't answered. He just looked at the man until he walked away, notebook still, empty hand, still twitching like he wasn't sure what to do with it. Jack had said it later, after the doors were locked again and the lights turned low. They don't care unless someone dies. Reggie hadn't disagreed. He just kept cleaning. But now, in the hush of morning, with the street outside bathed in the soft amber of a new day, something about the silence felt earned. Not like the empty kind that came from fear, but the full-bodied kind that follows resolve the way water stills after a stone has been thrown. A few customers showed up around 9 eyes wide as they stepped through the doorway, glancing at the patched wall, the bandaged knuckles, the bruises peeking beneath shirt sleeves. One of them, an older woman with a church hat and a voice like worn silk, placed a pie on the counter and whispered, "Thank you," without ever asking what had happened. By noon, more had arrived. Someone brought a box of cleaning supplies. Another offered fresh paint. A group of teens with work gloves and skateboards leaned against the wall, waiting for direction. It wasn't organized, but it was genuine. Reggie watched it all unfold from his usual booth, an ice pack on his left shoulder, and a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. For a long time he said nothing. Then he stood, cleared his throat, and pointed toward the back room. "Mops are there," he said. "Tools in the pantry. Be careful of the stove, it's been acting funny." And just like that, the rebuilding began. Tyrone showed up an hour later with a toolbox and a fresh bruise on his jaw. He walked over, shook Reggie's hand, then handed him a roll of bills without ceremony. "From the boys down at the gym," he said. "They said it ain't much, but it's something." Reggie took it not because he needed the money, but because refusing it would have dishonored what it meant. "Tell them I'll come by next week," he said. "We'll run a few drills. Might do them some good to remember where their feet go." Tyrone smiled at that, the kind of smile that made a man look 10 years younger. "You still got it," he said. Reggie nodded once. Enough to teach, not to chase. The jukebox, still functional despite the scuffle, hummed back to life around 3, and someone picked an old Sam Cooke song that drifted through the diner like a gentle reminder that time moves forward even when the world tries to hold it still. The lyrics wrapped around conversations like a soft scarf, filling the cracks between hammer swings, paintbrush strokes, and quiet laughter. Reggie stood behind the counter again by late afternoon apron, dusted with plaster eyes, tracing the same familiar path across the booths and tables. But this time everything felt different. Not new, not perfect, but earned. He didn't talk much that day, didn't need to. The people did it for him, telling stories, trading jokes, glancing at the battered walls like they understood something unspoken had happened here, something that couldn't be cleaned up or painted over. Jack pulled up a chair next to Reggie at one point, a soda in one hand, a bandage on his knuckle. "You think they'll come back?" he asked, not with fear, just curiosity. Reggie took a sip of coffee before answering. "Maybe," he said, "but next time they'll think twice." That's all we needed. The light outside had begun to soften again, turning the sidewalk gold and shadowed, and the breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and fried onions. The last of the volunteers packed up their things and drifted away with waves and shoulder squeezes and soft-spoken goodbyes. Reggie stood alone in the center of the diner dust, swirling in the fading light, the sound of Sam Cooke now replaced by the gentle click of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak of old wood settling. He picked up a broom, swept slowly along the floor, and let his breath slow deep, and even the way it used to just before the bell. This was not a victory parade. It wasn't a news headline or a viral video. It was something quieter, harder to name, but more permanent. It was what happens when a man decides that dignity is worth fighting for, even if the cost is steep and the praise is scarce. As he leaned the broom back into its corner and turned off the lights one by one, Reggie looked back at the empty booths, the clean floor and the repaired door, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, not relief, just right. The afternoon sun had already begun its slow descent when Reggie stepped outside the diner, his apron still dusted with flour and sawdust, the air thick with the warm scent of new paint-worn wood, and something that felt for the first time in a long time like safety. The street was quieter now, not in that tense, uncertain way it had been the past few weeks, but in a way that suggested people were breathing a little deeper, walking a little slower, letting themselves believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. Across the street, Jerome leaned against the doorframe of the barbershop, sipping from a paper cup and nodding slowly to a beat only he could hear. When he caught Reggie's eye, he raised the cup in a quiet toast. Reggie didn't wave back, he just nodded once, calm and full, the way men do when no words are needed anymore. Inside, the last of the morning's volunteers had gone home, leaving behind a space that wasn't spotless but felt solid, like something rebuilt with hands that remembered how to hold fast. The jukebox had been unplugged. For now, the booths reupholstered in mismatched fabric from two different donors, and the counter had a new finish that gleamed a little too bright under the overhead lights. But Reggie liked it that way. There was honesty and imperfection, something earned in the uneven corners and the small places where the old wood still showed through the polish. He moved through the space, slowly checking locks, straightening salt shakers, wiping down the register, even though it didn't need it. Rituals more than chores, actions that let his body settle, while his mind stayed just a few steps ahead. By the time he stepped into the office, the phone was already ringing. Not loud, just steady, a low buzz against the hum of the refrigerator, and the creak of the back door shifting slightly in its frame. Reggie let it ring once more before picking up, pressing the receiver to his ear with a tired hand. "Coleman," he said simply, and the voice on the other end was gravelly, sharp-edged and unfamiliar. "You, the owner of that place, across from the barber shop?" the man asked, voice laced with something that sounded like suspicion but not quite disrespect. "That's me," Reggie replied, his tone flat but open. The man paused, then said, "We've got some questions. Mind if we stop by?" They came 20 minutes later, two men in plain clothes with badges at their belts and expressions that said they'd rather be anywhere else. The older one introduced himself as Detective Harlan, his partner, a younger man with a twitch in his jaw and a habit of looking everywhere but into Reggie's eyes. They didn't sit, didn't ask for coffee, just stood near the door like they weren't sure whether this was a favor or an obligation. "We've been getting pressure from upstairs," Harlan said, voice low. "Apparently someone wants to know why this street's been so quiet all of a sudden." Reggie raised an eyebrow, then leaned against the counter. "Maybe because someone finally stood up when the wrong people came knocking," he said. Harlan gave a small nod. "Yeah, well, the city likes balance. Doesn't like surprises, especially the kind that end in broken bones and hospital visits." Reggie said nothing for a moment, just let the silence grow until it started to feel like weight. "You're not here to arrest anyone," he said at last. "You're here to make sure nobody calls the papers." The younger man shifted uncomfortably, but Harlan didn't flinch. "Something like that," he said. "There's talk of retaliation, and if that happens on your property, people start asking the wrong kinds of questions." Reggie folded his arms. "So what do you want from me?" Harlan looked him dead in the eye. "Stay quiet, keep your friends in line, and let us do our job before someone else decides it's theirs." Reggie considered that. Not just the words, but the message buried under them, the idea that peace was fine as long as it came with permission. That protection was only valid when it wore a badge, not when it walked in with nothing but old scars and a steady hand. "You do your job," Reggie said, calm as ever, "but don't expect me to stop doing mine." Harlan didn't argue. He just gave a nod, tipped his hat slightly, and left with his partner in tow, their footsteps echoing briefly before the door swung closed again. Later, after the last of the light had drained from the sky and the diner stood quiet under the flicker of the street lamp, Reggie sat alone at the front booth, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, and his eyes tracing the dark shapes of passing cars. He wasn't watching for trouble, not exactly, he was just present, the way a man stays present after a storm alert, not out of fear but out of respect for what might still be lingering in the air. Layla came in just before closing, carrying a bag of groceries and a book she'd been reading on and off for weeks. She didn't speak at first, just sat across from him and unpacked a few things onto the table: eggs, bread, a jar of honey. "You look tired," she said softly, like it wasn't a judgment, just an observation from someone who knew what tired really meant. Reggie gave her a half smile. "Feels different," he said. "Not the kind of tired that breaks you, the kind that tells you did something worth doing." She nodded, then looked down at the book. "I read something today," she said. "It said courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, 'I'll try again tomorrow.'" Reggie leaned back, the words settling into him like warm rain. "Sounds about right," he said. "Sounds about right." They sat there a while longer, the street outside growing still, the diner bathed in soft light and soft silence. And when Reggie finally stood, turned off the lights and locked the door behind them, he did it not with tension in his shoulders or fire in his chest, but with a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. Not peace handed to him, not peace negotiated or enforced, but the kind a man builds, with his own hands on his own ground, one day at a time. The days that followed passed slowly, not because time had slowed down, but because the air around Coleman's kitchen carried the heavy stillness of waiting, waiting for retaliation, waiting for news, waiting for whatever came after a storm you thought had already passed. Reggie kept to his rhythm, opening each morning at 6 on the dot, wiping down counters with the same steady hands, offering coffee to familiar faces, and pausing just long enough at the front window to scan the street like a man listening for footsteps in the dark. But something had shifted, not in him but in everything else. The neighborhood had begun to change in quiet, deliberate ways, like a street, slowly remembering how to walk without flinching. The gang was gone, at least for now. Most of them had scattered, some arrested, some limping, some too ashamed to show their faces in the daylight. But there were still shadows that lingered, corners that felt colder than they should have, and Reggie knew better than to believe anything was truly over. One afternoon, Jerome stepped into the diner and slid a folded newspaper across the counter without saying a word. The headline was small, buried on page 6, and read like a whisper instead of a warning: "Local man hospitalized after street altercation, suspected ties to gang activity." No names were printed, no credits given. But Reggie read it twice, not for facts, but for what wasn't said. When he looked up, Jerome was already sipping his coffee, his eyes calm but watchful. "They're talking," Reggie said, voice low but certain. Jerome nodded. "Yeah. But not loud enough to drown out what you did." He paused, then added, "People remember who stood up." That line stuck with Reggie long after the coffee cooled and the shadows stretched across the tile floor. People remember who stood up. Not who shouted the loudest or who threw the first punch, but who stayed standing when it mattered most. And that, more than anything, reminded him why he didn't regret a single bruise on his body or broken table in the shop. Around that same time, Layla had started keeping a notepad beside the register, jotting down names and numbers, folks offering to repaint, to donate, to help patch up what little damage remained. The list grew faster than Reggie expected. Teenagers who once loitered outside were now hauling wood and sweeping sidewalks. Retirees who rarely left their porches brought biscuits and spare tools and stories that somehow made everything feel rooted. One morning, an elderly man Reggie had only known by face brought in a new light fixture wrapped in a towel. "My son got this sitting in a box," he explained. "Said he didn't need it. Figured you might." Reggie didn't say much, just nodded, took the fixture in both hands, and thanked the man with a quiet sincerity that seemed to hang in the air even after the door closed behind him. The repairs were small, but what they symbolized wasn't tay. Each nail, each brushstroke, each gesture was a declaration that fear wouldn't hold space here anymore. One night, while wiping down the stove, Reggie glanced up and caught sight of his reflection in the vent hood eyes. Tired beard, a little grayer, shoulders broad but heavier than they'd been. He didn't recognize the man entirely. Not because he'd changed, but because for the first time in a long while, he saw himself through the lens of purpose rather than survival. He wasn't just someone who had been a fighter, he was someone who had chosen to fight when no one else wanted to. And that kind of choice, he realized, changes you more deeply than a title ever could. Jack stopped by a few days later, his hand still wrapped from a punch he'd thrown too clean to regret. He sat at the counter, said nothing for a while, then finally asked, "You ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't stepped in?" Reggie didn't answer immediately. He poured 2 cups of coffee, slid one toward Jack and said, "All the time." Jack took a sip, then nodded slowly, and Reggie looked out the window. "Then I remember that wondering, don't change what we did, and what we did, it mattered." That night, the bell above the door jingled softly, and a boy, no older than 15, stepped in head-down hands, stuffed into the pockets of a jacket, 2 sizes too big. He lingered near the entrance until Reggie waved him forward. "You hungry?" The boy nodded. Reggie pointed to a stool. "Sit. First one's on the house." Layla slid a plate of cornbread and greens in front of him a few minutes later, and Reggie watched the kid eat like someone who hadn't been welcome anywhere in days. "You got a name?" Reggie asked gently. The boy paused, then said Tariq. Reggie nodded. "Well, Tariq, this here's a place that stays standing. You understand?" The boy didn't reply, but his eyes said enough. Later that evening, after the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, Reggie sat alone at the back booth, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea and listening to the slow creak of the ceiling fan spinning overhead. Outside, the street was quiet again, but this time it felt earned. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that follows truth spoken plainly and a line drawn with care. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't need to, because for now this moment, this fragile, flickering calm, belonged to those who chose to stay. And when Reggie finally stood, stretched his back, and switched off the lights one by one, he did so without a second glance. The shop wasn't just fixed, it was reclaimed. And that in the quiet language of men who know how hard peace comes, was everything. By the time Saturday morning rolled around, something about the neighborhood felt different, not loud, not celebratory, just quietly, unmistakably alive, in a way it hadn't been in months. The sidewalks were swept cleaner than usual, not by the city but by the people who walked them. Front doors were open, letting music drift out in soft bursts, and children's voices echoed down the block like wind chimes set loose by hope. Coleman's kitchen opened right at 7, and before Reggie even had the chance to unlock the door, 3 regulars were already waiting outside. Hats in hand faces, lit not by hunger, but by something warmer, deeper. "You're late," Jerome teased, though he was smiling when he said it. Reggie chuckled and held the door open wide. "Y'all just early for once." Inside, the air carried that familiar mix of bacon, grease, hot coffee, and something sweet rising from the oven, comfort food for a community that had been starving for a different kind of nourishment. Layla was already behind the counter, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, and a rhythm in her step that matched the low jazz playing from the corner speaker. She caught Reggie's eye as he walked in and raised an eyebrow. "You ready for this?" Reggie shrugged, then smiled just enough to crease the corners of his eyes. "I've fought tougher mornings." By 8 o'clock, the place was full. Not packed, not wild, just comfortably full in the way that made every seat feel earned, and every voice a part of something bigger. An older couple brought a tray of cookies and left them by the register without asking for credit. A group of high schoolers set up folding chairs near the window, sharing stories and laughter over plates of fried catfish and collard greens. Even the sheriff, who hadn't set foot inside since the incident, walked in, nodded respectfully, and sat down with no backup, no badge on display, just a man ordering eggs over easy like everyone else. And while Reggie moved through the room with the quiet grace of someone who belonged to the space as much as it belonged to him, there was something else happening too, something under the surface, in the way people looked at him now, not with curiosity or suspicion, not even with reverence, just a kind of recognition, like they finally saw him whole, not just as a man who cooked and cleaned and kept things calm, but as someone who had chosen deliberately and at cost to protect what mattered. And the beauty of it was, he didn't need to say a word about it. Sometime after noon, Clyde showed up wearing his old baseball cap and a faded navy jacket that still held the outline of his security patch. He dropped a paper bag on the counter and leaned in close. "Red beans and rice from my wife," he said. "She said you earned more than just a handshake." Reggie laughed and took the bag, warmth spreading through his chest like a slow pour of sunlight. "Tell her I'll trade her for a peach cobbler," he replied. "Deal," Clyde said, already turning to greet someone at the door. Throughout the day, folks came and went, not with urgency but with intention. They didn't rush in or out. They lingered. They helped clear plates that weren't theirs. They offered chairs to strangers. And every time the door swung open, Reggie looked up just long enough to see whether it was someone new or someone returning, then returned to what he was doing with the calm rhythm of a man at peace with his place. It wasn't just the diner that changed. By early evening, the barber shop across the street had propped its door open, music spilling out, as Jerome and another barber gave free trims to kids lined up along the sidewalk. A little girl danced to the beat in sparkly shoes, while her mother watched from a bench head tilted toward the sun. On the corner, Malik was showing 3 young boys how to wrap their hands in gauze properly, the movements slow and deliberate, his voice low, but certain, the kind of voice that builds discipline where chaos used to live. When the sun began to set, painting the pavement in soft amber tones, Reggie stepped outside with a dish towel over his shoulder and leaned against the doorway. He watched it all unfold, the laughter, the rhythm, the gentle return to something that looked a little like harmony, and for a moment he didn't feel tired, he didn't feel old. He just felt right there, grounded, and still a witness to something that didn't need headlines or applause. Just presence. A voice beside him broke the silence. "You think they'll come back?" It was Layla, her arms folded, eyes scanning the same scene. Reggie didn't answer right away. He took a breath, deep and even, and let the sounds of the street carry the weight of the question for a beat. "Maybe," he said finally, "but now they'll know this place doesn't break easy." She nodded once, not like someone who needed reassurance, but like someone who already believed it. As night settled in and the last few customers trickled out, Reggie turned off the lights in the dining area, one switch at a time. Each click was soft, final, like punctuation marks at the end of a story well told. The floor creaked beneath his feet, familiar and forgiving, and the air held the fading warmth of people who had come together, not out of fear, but out of choice. And when he finally locked the front door, standing for a moment in the quiet glow of the street lamp, he felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but something quieter and steadier. A sense of knowing that no matter what came next, this day had stood on its own. Not as a battle, not as a warning, but as proof that rebuilding doesn't always start with bricks. It starts with people who remember how to stay. The morning after the neighborhood cleanup, Reggie found himself walking the perimeter of the block before dawn, not because he didn't trust the quiet, but because old habits die slow when you've lived through storms. The air was thick with dew, cool against his skin, and the sky overhead had that deep navy blue that comes just before the sun decides it's time to rise. Street lamps still hummed softly, casting long shadows down sidewalks that had been swept clean by hands that remembered what pride felt like. A few storefronts still had their security gates down, but there were lights on behind them, signs of movement, signs of life, signs that the people here weren't just surviving anymore, they were staying. Reggie walked with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, slow and steady, letting the sound of his boots on concrete mark the rhythm of the morning. When he turned the corner and saw Coleman's Kitchen ahead, its sign glowing faintly in the pre-dawn light, he paused, took in the full shape of the building windows, repaired steps, swept a fresh coat of paint around the trim, and felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest. It wasn't pride exactly, and it wasn't relief. It was something deeper, a sense of rightness, of things in their place. He stepped inside just after 6 keys jingling faintly, and was greeted by the familiar smell of coffee already brewing, and the faint crackle of the old radio in the corner that Layla insisted on keeping tuned to the blues station. She was already behind the counter sleeves, rolled hair up the steam from the griddle rising around her like morning fog. "You're early," she said without looking up. Reggie smiled and hung his jacket on the hook by the door. "So are you," he replied, stepping behind the counter and reaching for a mug. She handed him one already filled black hot, just the way he liked it. They worked in silence for a while, the kind that comes not from tension but from ease. 2 people moving in sync, unspoken rhythm between them. The bell above the door chimed around 7, and one by one, the regulars filtered in, each greeted with a nod, a smile, a plate, just the way they liked it. No one talked about what had happened. No one had to. The new energy in the room said enough. People were sitting longer, speaking softer, laughing in a way that reached their eyes. There was no tension in their shoulders, no glancing at the door every few seconds. Just presence, just peace. Around mid-morning, Clyde came in with a newspaper under one arm and a slight limp in his right leg. He sat at the counter, unfolded the paper, and tapped a small article with one thick finger. "Look at this," he said, pushing it toward Reggie. The headline was modest: "Community rebuilds after street violence cites local unity as key." The photo showed a group of volunteers outside the diner, paint rollers in hand, sunlight cutting through the dust in golden rays. Reggie read the article slowly, his eyes pausing on each line, not because he didn't understand it, but because he wanted to feel every word. "They got most of it right," Clyde said, sipping his coffee. "Not all, but most." Reggie set the paper down, folded it once, and nodded. "That's more than I expected," he said, "and more than they usually give." Clyde grunted in agreement. "Still," he added, "doesn't change what we know, doesn't change what you did." Reggie didn't respond. He just picked up the coffee pot and refilled Clyde's cup the way he had 100 times before. Later that day, after the lunch rush had come and gone and the din of silverware on plates had faded into soft conversation, Reggie stepped outside and stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, eyes on the mural across the street. Someone had painted it overnight, a silhouette of a man standing tall, fists at his sides, the words, "We Stay Standing," written in bold letters underneath. It wasn't detailed, but it didn't have to be. Everyone who saw it knew exactly who it was meant to represent. Layla came up beside him, holding 2 lemonades and offering one without a word. He took it, nodded his thanks, and they stood there together in the slow heat of the afternoon, watching the mural dry under the sun. "You know," she said softly, "that might be the first time I've seen something go up on these walls that wasn't a warning or a complaint." Reggie took a sip, the cold citrus biting just enough to wake something in him. "Yeah," he said, "feels different, doesn't it?" They stayed there a while, not talking, just listening to the neighborhood breathe. You could hear the rhythm if you paid attention. Kids laughing down the block, a nail gun popping from a roof repair, a screen door slamming shut, then opening again a few seconds later. All of it layered over the low hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a restless dog. It was the sound of a place stitching itself back together in real time. When the sun finally began its slow drop toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Reggie turned back toward the diner, held the door open for Layla, and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang the same way it always had, but somehow, today, it felt like more than a sound. It felt like punctuation, like the close of a sentence that had taken a long time to finish. And as he looked around the room at the people, the light, the small scuffs on the floor that no one bothered to hide, Reggie felt something deep and quiet settle into his bones. Not triumph, not even peace, just clarity. The kind that comes not from winning but from knowing exactly who you are and why you chose to stay. The evening light was soft when it spilled through the front windows of Coleman's kitchen, catching dust motes mid-air and setting them alight like tiny embers floating in silence. Reggie stood behind the counter, wiping down the last of the plates from the day, his movements unhurried, almost meditative, as if each swipe of the towel helped him process what the last few weeks had demanded of him. The diner was empty now, not in a lonely way, but in that peaceful end-of-the-day hush that feels like a long breath finally exhaled. Outside, the street had settled the kind of calm that only comes after something hard has been faced and met with quiet resolve. The sky had turned that dusky lavender color that meant the day was almost over, and Reggie found himself leaning against the counter, eyes on the horizon, thinking about all the days that came before. It wasn't just the neighborhood that had changed. It was him too, in ways too subtle for mirrors to catch, but too deep to ignore. He could feel it in the way his shoulders sat more naturally, in the quiet steadiness of his thoughts, in how much slower his pulse felt, even when he caught a noise outside or a car pulling up a little too slowly near the curb. The tension that used to live inside his chest like a coiled rope had loosened, not because the threat had vanished, but because he had remembered what he was capable of, and maybe more importantly, why he'd ever been willing to walk away from that part of himself in the first place. He turned off the sink faucet with a firm click and dried his hands, listening as the last few notes of an old Otis Redding song drifted from the jukebox before fading into silence. The smell of baked cornbread still lingered faintly in the air, mixed with coffee grounds and the sweetness of butter cooling on the stove. He crossed the room and flipped the chairs onto the tables one by one, the legs clacking softly against wood in a rhythm that belonged only to closing time. As he worked, his thoughts wandered not far, not to regret but to memory. He thought of his trainer Mickey all those years ago standing in the locker room after a brutal match, his voice rough with exhaustion and something like pride. "You fight with your hands, sure," Mickey had said, "but it's your choices that decide what kind of man you'll be after the gloves come off." Back then, Reggie hadn't fully understood what that meant. But now, standing here older and far from the ring, he understood it completely. Because it wasn't the fists that had kept this block standing, it was the choices, the refusal to run, the willingness to hold the line even when no one was watching. The bell above the door jingled softly, and he turned to see Layla step in her sweatshirt, pulled tight around her arms, a brown paper bag tucked under one elbow. She looked at him with a faint smile, the kind that said she didn't need to explain why she'd come back after closing. "I made too much," she said, lifting the bag toward him. "Thought you could use a second dinner." Reggie took it with a chuckle, peeking inside to find a still-warm container of stew and 2 cornbread muffins wrapped in foil. "You spoil me," he said, and she rolled her eyes. "Only fair after what you did for this place." She sat at the counter while he poured 2 mugs of tea, and for a while they just sat there in companionable quiet, sipping slowly, listening to the muffled sounds of the city easing into night. Eventually, Layla glanced toward the mural across the street, faded now a little chipped but still standing tall. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stayed?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. Reggie took his time, answering, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "All the time," he said. "But then I remember if I had walked away, it wouldn't have just been about me. It would have been about everyone watching, thinking maybe they ought to walk too." She nodded quietly, letting that settle. The truth of it didn't need explaining. That's how leadership works, Reggie thought. Not in speeches or titles, but in actions done when no one expects you to step forward. That night he chose to fight back. Wasn't about pride or revenge, it was about drawing a line and saying, "Not here, not like this, not anymore." Outside, the streetlight flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, where a group of teens had once loitered and now sometimes helped repaint shutters and water sidewalk plants. The whole block had become something different, not perfect, not untouchable, but stronger, more aware of its own worth. And that mattered more than any headline or thank you card ever could. Reggie looked over at Layla, who was now peeling the label from her tea bottle in slow, absent-minded motions. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She didn't look up, just shook her head. "I used to," she said. "But now this place is teaching me who I want to be." Reggie smiled at that, soft and deep, the kind of smile that doesn't show up in photos but lives quietly behind the eyes. They sat there until the tea went cold, neither one in a rush to break the silence. Eventually, Layla stood and gathered her things, giving him a gentle pat on the shoulder as she passed. "You know," she said, turning back once before stepping out, "sometimes I think this whole street got its backbone back the minute you said no." Reggie didn't answer. He just nodded, once turned out the light behind the counter and watched the door close with that soft, familiar click. Then, for the first time in weeks, he walked to the back, switched off the remaining lights, and locked up without checking over his shoulder. He paused in the hallway, his reflection faint in the glass, then smiled quietly to himself. Outside, the street was still, and this time it felt like it belonged to the people who'd earned it. There are moments in life when we don't need to run and we don't need to fight, we just need to stand our ground. Reggie's story and that of his neighborhood reminds us that sometimes it's quiet, strength, steady resolve, and silent courage that can transform an entire community. Not everyone has a powerful punch, but each of us can make a choice to stay, to stand up, and to protect what's right. For those who've weathered many seasons of life, the lesson here is clear. We're never too old to be someone others can lean on. It's never too late to be an example of integrity. Because things like respect, safety, and trust can only be built through the right choices made over and over, day by day. And sometimes it takes just one person standing firm to change a whole neighborhood forever. If this story touched your heart, if you believe courage and character still have a place in this world, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share this video to spread these meaningful values even further. Every single subscription is a show of support for honest, powerful storytelling made, especially for strong, seasoned souls like yours. Thank you for listening.